If chance will have me king, why, chance may crown me without my stir. Alright, sorry for butchering that. Cue intro. Dice have been used since before recorded history. They've been used to predict the future, to aid in math, but most importantly, in games. They're handy physical doodads that help simulate chaos. The idea that there are unpredictable outcomes to certain situations. Today, we'll be diving into how randomness is applied to games, why it's useful, and why I ultimately decided against using it in my upcoming narrative game. Let's take a look at randomness in narrative games. If you've ever played a tabletop game before, you are probably familiar with how dice are generally used. You roll the little clickety-clackety stone, it lands on a number, and that number represents some value in the game. A very common example of this is combat. You roll the dice, you add the numbers together, and that's the amount of damage you deal to your opponent. But why use dice for that? Why not just express that damage value through a constant number? Why do games use randomness at all? There's a couple of reasons for this, and we'll dive right into those. Reason number one, simulation. One explanation is that sometimes as designers, we need to reproduce factors that are beyond the player's control. Let me explain. If you're making a simple war game where dice represents your army, you might not want to include the lay of the land, the state of your troops' equipment, weather conditions, or any other external factors that could change the outcome of a real-life battle. Accounting for all of that will make the game not only a chore to play, but also incredibly hard to learn. Instead of doing all that, you can let the random numbers of dice simulate that for you. Rolling high numbers means all those factors were in your favor, and rolling low means that the forces were arrayed against you. Reason number two, risk. Another reason to use dice is to play on people's emotional reaction to risk. People generally react strongly to getting good or bad results, with joy and frustration, respectively. These emotions introduce a very human element to your game. Succeeding in challenges now feel more rewarding, and taking risks feels more dangerous. A good example of that approach is tabletop role-playing games, such as Dungeons & Dragons or Kids on Bikes. In those games, you play a character, usually of your own creation, and cooperate with other players to tell a story together. Interactions within the story, like physically moving a heavy object or trying to persuade a non-player character, are determined by a roll of the die. The story then takes a turn if you roll excessively bad or fantastically well. This is generally referred to as a skill check, a die roll that needs to be the specific number to succeed. Skill, a numeric representation of your character's personal attributes, such as strength, intelligence, or charisma, is then added to the roll. If you fail particularly badly at your skill check, usually something bad happens to your character in the story as a result. For example, your character, Betty Steelarms, rolls a strength skill check to try to flip a police car, but fails. The cops then exit the car to arrest Betty. But imagine how cool it would have been if she succeeded instead. So, randomness can be pretty useful. It helps create risk without having to account for real-life factors, and it introduces a chance element to your game, which keeps players emotionally invested. But then, what is the problem with randomness in game narrative? While playing tabletop games, "Why am I rolling so badly today?" is a sentence I hear my friends say often. Notice the subject, I, here. Even though dice are random by nature, players feel some sort of control over rolling them. In digital games, where randomness exists, but dice are not physically present, some of this sense of control is lost. Players might think a computer generating a low outcome for their roll is unfair because they didn't throw the dice themselves. In story-driven narrative video games, randomness often takes the same form as the tabletop role-playing games I described earlier. Some story branches are locked away behind skill checks, or good and bad outcomes are decided by it. One of my favorite video games, Disco Elysium, takes this approach. You interact with people and objects through dialogue options and rolling skill checks now and then to unlock a new option. Failing is often just as interesting as succeeding, and failure is a big theme in Disco Elysium. Still, in some critical moments, I found myself wanting a good outcome and being unsatisfied with the bad one. The game allows you to save and load, and the dice roll is different each time you do, so there's nothing really stopping you from trying again and again and again. Your skill values are also changed by outfits, so sometimes I've found myself changing my wardrobe in front of characters to have a better chance at succeeding a skill check. Doing that a couple of times can really take you out of the experience. You can retry some skill check after you've leveled up your character as well, which really undermines the consequence of failing them in the first place. Other games that have similar skill check interactions, like Sunless Seas and Sunless Skies, automatically save the game whenever you get the result of the roll, forcing you to roll with the punches, so to speak. Pun intended. Just like in the tabletop role-playing games that we talked about before, there is no going back and retrying. What's different about these games is that the story is systemic, a design principle I talk about at length in another video I made. Link on the screen, I think? There, somewhere. Each run of these games can be seen as a unique story, with new characters, different goals, different skills, and a different end. Failing a roll is just another way to make your run more unique. For the latter examples, I think randomness is well suited to its style of storytelling. But for Disco Elysium and other traditional branching story video games, I often wonder if there might be a better alternative to the randomness of skill checks. An alternative that doesn't involve grinding experience, changing your outfit, or saving and loading a bunch of times to succeed. How to not depend on randomness in narrative games. So, how can we get rid of those random elements, but keep the benefits of what they try to achieve? Let's create an example of a game together. In this game, let's have the player investigate a crime by finding evidence, questioning suspects, and going to the right places at the right time. Let's say all of these interactions are done via dialogue options that are displayed in a list. When a player chooses a dialogue option, it will follow a unique branch of the story based on that choice. For that, we want to keep the function of skill checks, but do away with the unpredictable randomness. A good way to go about removing randomness from your game is to see what purposes it serves in the first place, and then find a different solution for each one. Let's do that now! First purpose, risk. With dice roll skill checks, it is often implied that succeeding a check has a good outcome and failing a check has a bad one. That risk builds the emotional load of joy and frustration. For our little example game, I propose that a skill check is only available if the player's skill value meets the number specified to succeed in the challenge. You can see it as a gate that locks a dialogue option, and skill is the key to open it. Well, they took a similar approach for Fallout New Vegas as opposed to Fallout 3's earlier skill system. Instead of having a percentage probability of succeeding or failing a check, they just put a constant threshold to pass or fail instead. But I'd like to go one step further. I'd like to remove the concept of failing a skill check altogether. This means that there is no risk of failing because of unfair random numbers. My reasoning behind this is that the skill only determines if you can do something, but does not determine if you should. Succeeding a skill check does not mean you are free of its consequences. To achieve that, many skill checks we write should potentially lead to negative outcomes. The player must then use logic and empathy to navigate that themselves. For example, a skill called coercion would allow the player to pressure people emotionally. Using this skill could make interrogations easy, but will sour the relationship with that character, which might have unforeseen consequences down the line. If they somehow damage that relationship permanently, it is ultimately the player's choice. Note that this does usually require foreshadowing, so players are not completely in the dark of any harsh consequences. Cool, so we add risk to the story branches themselves. What's next? Replayability. Normally, dice rolls can create replayability by locking you out of certain options if you fail a skill check. A lot of people would be curious to see other outcomes than the one they had. However, if a player achieves the same outcome even in their second playthrough because of chance, wouldn't that be frustrating? Potentially, we've already fixed this problem by locking branches behind a skill gate. If a player's playthrough is drastically different with a different set of skills, this can motivate them to play again and see the other skill branches. While testing this out though, I ran into some problems with this. In order to create a different experience for every playthrough, you need many different branches, resulting in a huge list of dialogue options. Many of these options would be locked off to the player initially, because they might not have the necessary skill. That will quickly clutter the screen and overload the player with choices. Even the options themselves might act a little bit like spoilers, giving away information the player is not supposed to know without investing in those skills. We could just hide all dialogue options that the player does not have the adequate skill value for. But then the player wouldn't know where to find any new dialogue options available to them when they do invest in that skill though. Also, if the player is not aware that there are other options to choose from, they might not even be motivated to try another playthrough at all. So I came up with something deceptively simple that kind of solves those problems. Let's say that in our little example game, each skill can be improved from 1 to a maximum of 5. That means that the player cannot select a branch option with a skill check of 4 if they only have 3 in that skill. Now, my little trick is to reveal skill checks that are 1 higher than the player's current skill value, but hide any checks that are higher than that. So, the skill check of 4 will be visible to the player, but they still won't be able to actually select it. This way, you might wonder what will happen if you come back to a situation with more or less in a certain skill. That means that the player will see dialogue options everywhere around the game that aren't available to them yet, but will be if they improve that skill by just 1. What's more, if they do improve that skill, a whole slew of new options of 1 point higher will suddenly become visible. This gives players feedback on their progress, motivates them to keep exploring areas they've already been to, and most importantly, asks the question, what will be different if I restart the game with different skills? Great! Now we've added some replayability using skill checks. Now, on to the last purpose of randomness: simulation. As I described in the wargame example at the start of this video, you can use randomness to reproduce factors that are overly complex. Since we try not to rely on randomness in our example game, we could just choose not to implement any complex variables. For simulation, it's best to decide on a case-by-case basis which factors you want to include. For example, are weather factors going to be important to our example game? Probably not, but let's include it anyway, for the sake of this exercise. Let's say we want to include snow and rain, so that the footprints of the perpetrator our player is chasing get left behind as clues or wash away respectively. Instead of switching between snow and rain by chance or probability, we can opt for a repeating pattern. We have snow in the morning, rain at noon, snow again in the afternoon, and rain in the evening. This pattern then repeats exactly in that order every day, every session, or every playthrough. If you layer enough of these repeating patterns on top of each other, it gives the illusion of complex real-life factors. The difference, however, is that now players can recognize and remember the pattern to plan their actions accordingly. It becomes a puzzle instead of a gamble. I think in the case of a crime investigation game, like our example, these elements should be predictable. That way players can use their deduction capabilities instead of relying on luck. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide if simulating complex factors is relevant to your game at all. But in the context of game narrative, I believe randomness should be applied sparingly for this purpose, especially if there are alternatives that fulfill the same purpose. In conclusion, randomness has many handy uses in game design, but it's important to know why and how it's being used to see if it fits your game specifically. Especially in narrative games, randomness can easily become frustrating to players if it's not applied appropriately. Make sure randomness is the right tool for your game by examining what purpose it's supposed to serve. If it doesn't fit your themes, mechanics, or aesthetics, go through those purposes one by one and try to find alternate solutions that achieve the same result. We've talked a lot about skill checks in this video, which I found the prime example of randomness in narrative games. But surely you can think of many other creative ways to apply randomness to your storytelling. To conclude, randomness should be used sparingly in narrative. But that is not to say that I'm trying to dissuade you from using randomness in narrative games at all. In fact, I made an entire video about how to control randomness in procedural narrative. I'll put the link like somewhere here. That's about it. Thanks for watching, and a special little thanks to Sapuliti,
Bob, and Danusai,
who support me on Ko-fi. That's right, I have a Ko-fi page, which is the best way to support me as a creator. You can subscribe there, like do a monthly thing to get like VIP Discord access and your name in the credits of these videos. If you're not into that kind of thing, then that's also fine. Just subscribe to see when the new video drops. Alright, I think that's about it.